Hi, I'm Michelle Kuhn, and welcome to Hidden Gems in the History of Music. Today I have a guest, Christine Malec, whom I've known for about 12 years or so. And Chris, when I first met you, you were a massage therapist, but since then you've put on many different hats, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm a member of Toronto's blind community. I make my living doing podcasting and also writing and storytelling, but also one of my income streams is as a musician with a Patreon page, but also in busking in the Toronto subway system, which I love.
Ah, sounds interesting. We'll talk about that later for sure. This guy we're going to talk about today, Donald, I'm very bad with his name.
Turlough O'Carolan.
Turlough O'Carolan. Okay, I'm glad you're here to give me the right name, because I just kind of looked him up a little bit recently, but I know you know more about him than I do. What got you interested in Turlough
O'Carolan? So a blind friend of mine, Kim Kilpatrick, is a storyteller, and she first mentioned his name to me as a harper, a harpist, a harp player and composer of music for the harp who lived in Ireland in the late 1700s, and apparently he is of such renown that there are statues of him in different places in Ireland. And he became blind when he was 17 or 18 because of smallpox, and he lived a long life and a very prestigious career as a traveling musician and composer for the harp. As a blind person, and as a blind person myself, I was really intrigued by this, because I know some of the challenges I face in a modern world, with sort of accessibility as a goal and equality as something that we value. And I wondered so much, how would someone like me with the same kind of lived experience, how would he function in that world? And so I felt this kinship to him as a musician, but also as a blind person trying to make his way in the world. And it got my storytelling centers of my brain sort of churning, because we can read about him and read facts about him and listen to his music, but how can we know what he felt, or how he got through his days, or what strategies did he have for getting things done, and how did he conceive of himself in a world where disability was, sometimes a source of shame or ridicule, to be frank. That's just sort of true, that those things would have been abroad in his world. And so how did he think of himself, and how did he manage his career? So the theoretical parts, but also just the practical day-to-day. I know how I do things, but how did someone in a pre-industrial society with very different attitudes and very little, technology, how did he get through his days? So I just got really interested in thinking about this idea of blind musicians in history, but particularly this guy. I have Irish background too, so I felt a certain connection to that as well. And I've been to Ireland, and Irish people are just so lovely, and I felt very at home there. So he was a good starting place for me to start thinking about blind musicians in history and what their experience might have been.
That's all really interesting, yeah. I mean, we have a lot of information from back then through people's letters, but it depends on who they were and if they wrote letters. He wouldn't have been writing letters, being a blind person, and because he was a traveling musician, the people, he probably wouldn't have had people writing letters about him so much. They might have put some things down on paper, but I don't think we know as much about him as we might know about some other people in other situations.
Yes, and also I'm conscious of that some of the blind musicians that we know about were living and performing and thriving in very urban settings, like say Vienna or Paris or St. Petersburg, and O'Carolan was sort of on a horse riding through rural Ireland, and so even for the day he wouldn't have had access to as much infrastructure and a sophisticated postal system, or the same kind of affluence or settled urban life that other blind musicians might have had who were, say, in continental Europe.
Right. Now, so I did some reading on him, which was fascinating actually, and I did notice that they talked about him being set off with a horse and a guide, so he did have a guide with him. And I also read that sometimes he composed as he was riding his horse, which is kind of interesting. Because we're talking about compositions that he never wrote down that would have been passed on orally through, you know, generations of harpists and folk singers kind of type situations, you know. So that's really interesting to me, that part of it where that, you know, this music, he was apparently very well loved, and he wrote a lot of music for people, like it might be the ode to so-and-so or whatever. So he wrote using people's names oftentimes to them, and a lot of these have come down, I think something like 200 have come down of his, some large amount of his tunes have come down through the ages. And I'm sure some of them might have been changed a little bit, because oral tradition is kind of like, you know, the telephone thing where you're all in a circle and you whisper to your friend, and by the end of the time it gets over here, it can be quite different. But my understanding is they've tried to keep these tunes pretty much like they were when O'Carolan, I got his name now, O'Carolan, I knew his name, I just couldn't say. O'Carolan was singing them and composing them. So.
Yeah, and I mean, folk music is by definition changeable. And one of the things about the song titles that, and this is common to many musicians of the time, like I was going through some of his songs that I enjoy, his pieces, and they'll have names like Captain O'Kane.
Yes.
And you go and look at the history of who is that guy. Oh, he was a soldier who killed like 500 people in Holland or something, and it's a bloodthirsty person, but he was the person with the money. So as now, so it was then, that musicians also had to play to who was going to pay them. And so many songs are titled for, you know, people who had money, who were often in the military class as well. And so some of my favorite compositions of his and other musicians are named for people with really bloodthirsty pasts. And that's just the nature of making money as an artist. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
There you go, yes. Indeed. I also read that he got married when he was 50. Now that I thought was interesting, because I don't believe that a female blind person at the time, a woman who, even if they had become a singer or a harpist, I have a feeling they would not have been married, because the women at that time were supposed to look after the men. Right?
I don't think she was blind. I never saw a reference to the idea that his wife was blind. No. So she may have been, but I don't know that was. But I'm just saying that
if he had been a woman, he probably wouldn't have been able to get married. He wasn't marriageable.
That's very interesting. And he was famous, and for a musician of that time, probably reasonably prosperous. So yes, his fame and whatever money he had would have worked to his advantage. But there's other, like, these factors of socioeconomic status and gender are hugely relevant also when we're looking at any musician in history. But particularly if you are either a woman or have a disability or are born into a low socioeconomic status, you've got a big challenge. And if any of those intersect, then you really got a challenge. So that's why the blind musicians in history, another reason why it's so interesting to me, is that there's this intersectionality that comes into play.
Right, and that goes right into this whole hidden gems, right? Because they are kind of hidden gems. They either are women, or, you know, could be blind composer, or they're of a lower class or whatever. And so they weren't looked at first. When researchers started to go, okay, let's learn more about Bach and Mozart, you know, they didn't go, let's go, you know, check out Clara Schumann right away.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So
it's also true, like, I've become more aware since you and I have started talking about these ideas, that some of the famous musicians that we know by name did lose their sight later in life. And so there's also that overlap where the musician is well known, but their disability may not be. And so it's an issue of what does history think is worth recording, and who gets remembered in what ways. It's
so true. I mean, when I was in university, I remember hearing that, Bach went blind at the end of his life, and that was just a little, an aside there. But, there was actually a big story to that. We're not going to go into that today, I don't think, because we need to listen to some of this guy's music, but Bach and Handel both were blind at the end of their life for several years. and they both were treated by the same doctor who was a charlatan, and that's like a whole other podcast. Very interesting one, actually. But yeah, you're right about that for sure. So let's listen to the O'Carolan's Ramble to Cashel, or Cashel. Okay, so what drew you to that song? That's the one that you picked.
The first thing was the title. Before I'd even listened to it, I liked the title because there's this little sort of cultural thing among the blind community where it's something any blind person would recognize when you tell the story. You walk into a room in someone else's house, and immediately they're really sweetly attentive to help you find a chair and sit down and be settled. And sometimes when a sighted person walks into a room, they'll just sort of stroll around or stand around or shuffle their feet and just want to be standing. And so this is a complicated way of saying a ramble is not something that is naturally associated with a blind person. So a blind person usually moving from one place to another is very focused on safety and getting there and getting the job done. And that's totally accurate and true, but the idea of rambling is really appealing. And so I loved the idea of just thinking about Turlough O'Carolan going for a ramble with his walking stick. And so then when I listened to the song, what really drew me was I find it very lyrical. Like the melody is very dynamic to me, and as my primary interest in music is singing, and so I found myself wishing there were words that I could sing with the melody that's very dynamic and moving around a lot. And there's this little double note that happens on the harp where I think it's the same note and the same octave even, but it's two strings doing the same note occasionally, and I really like that too. And there's a repetition. I'm not a sophisticated musician. I'm not a jazz musician, for example, so I appreciate the repetition and the patterns of it, but mostly I would say it's the sort of lyricism of the melody that attracted me.
And I'm sure it must be the melodies that, because I listened to a few of his and they're all very pretty, that have, survived the test of time. Because if it's not a melody that kind of moves you, nobody's going to want to listen to it. Nobody's going to want to revive it or do it again.
Right.
Let's listen to it. Let's listen to another one. Now, you talked about Captain O'Kane, yes?
Yes.
Did you listen to that one?
I did. I liked it.
Yeah, I did too. I like that one too.
It's very nice major key,
yes.
cheerful.
It was cheerful. Here we go. It's very pretty.
There's a sort of wistful quality too. Like it's cheerful, but there's a sort of wistful quality in the melody. Like again, my mind is wanting to have words there so I can sing them, and so I'm trying to imagine what words I would put to it. And it's a maybe a missing of someone, like a missing of a good friend. You miss someone or are remembering someone. So it has a certain wistful quality to it, to my mind.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with that. So. Do you think there were lyrics to his pieces?
Apparently some of them did have lyrics. Not too many of them are preserved, and it makes me very curious. And also thinking about how widely was his music shared, performed, and known at the time. So were there musicians in pubs or on a street corner, say in the, you know, in 1800, playing Turlough O'Carolan tunes and singing them. And so how did his music live? And music sort of lives better when there's words associated with it, because our minds are sort of hardwired to tell stories.
That's true. That's true. It can, yeah, for sure. So that's interesting. Like, I'm going to leave the links to these pieces that people can listen to, and then anybody who wants to go check out more of his music, I think it's very pretty, and it's very nice to listen to. But I kind of want to switch gears a little bit to, all right, so we talked about him and his horse, making his way, making his music, meeting all these people. Apparently he must have been very, you know, amenable person, a very nice person, a very social person. Now I know you're also a nice person, a social person, and you do your busking. And so it's kind of, there was a similarity there of him going out and playing his pieces and you busking music in the TTC.
There is, I feel a certain sense of kinship around that too, because I'm not, you know, on a horse trekking around the countryside, and yet there's, you know, I'm in spaces where people are moving. There's this sense of travel every time I'm playing, because everyone who's moving past me and hearing me is on their way from somewhere to somewhere else. And there's my favorite thing about busking is that people can choose to listen or they can choose to tune me out. So I don't love being on stage, being the performer, making air quotes. I don't love that aspect of musicianship, but being the optional music that someone can tune into or tune out of really appeals to me. And that sense of being placed in the public sphere is really satisfying to me. And this is something I think about a lot in the context of blind musicians in history, that historically musicianship and storytelling were two of the few ways that a blind person could achieve acclaim, social status, and economic independence historically. So I'm in a long line of good company when I perform music, but also that public sphere aspect is huge, because particularly in the past, in O'Carolan's time, disability was hidden. It was a source of, you know, potentially shame, ridicule, disenfranchisement, all true. Not to say that that was true in every instance. Every family and community has its own norms, but to be in the position of being the one who's got the loudest voice. Like when I'm in the subway, my job is to be louder than everyone else. And how often do we get to have that moment?
That's true.
And especially as a person with a disability, I think about this. And for O'Carolan to put himself in the public sphere, in the public eye as a performer, I'd love to know more about where did he perform. Was it always, you know, in a castle great hall and were people completely attentive, or was he in the public square and people were walking by like they do when I busk? But for me, it's the element of being in the public eye and putting yourself in the public sphere in a thumbing of the nose way, like, yeah, I'm right here, this is me doing my thing. So I feel connected to him in that way.
Oh, that's really interesting. I have a couple of questions about busking. Like, I've gone past buskers, and I think, you know, I always try to have some change, give them some change, and I always like nod to them, thank you, and sometimes I say thank you out loud. Now, but they look back at me. So as a blind person, do you ever feel like, I don't know, not connected to them, or do people ever kind of brush by you, or do they stop and talk? Like, how does that work for you?
That's a really insightful question. It's true. There is an element of disconnect there, because unless someone speaks to me directly or auditorily throws money into my case, I'm not able to interact with them directly. So a great day for me is obviously when I make a lot of money, but also if someone just stops to say hi, or that sounds great, or have a great day, or you've got a beautiful voice. Like, I love the compliments, of course. And so you're right when you note that there is a certain disconnect in that way, and that's just that's my experience, and so I accept it. And so if if you like buskers, let them know in whatever way is going to work for them. So in fact, when I'm busking, I have my white cane with me. I keep it folded and it's in my case, very visible. For that reason is that I want people to know, if they can understand what it means when they see this, if they know what it means, they know I'm blind. So if they want to connect and take the moment to think about it, they'll understand that, hey, say a word or make a sound or something. So I offer people the opportunity to understand why I'm not making eye contact, or the opportunity to think, oh, if I want to communicate with her, a smile isn't gonna work. So I'm mindful. I do it mindfully. I keep my cane very visible for that reason.
That's really good. So I'm also wondering about, I know that, like, as you know, we met through Richard, my partner, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and I remember when I first started going out with him, people would be like, he's blind, like, they had some people, not all people, some people were just, oh, okay, fine, but some people were like a little scared or a little freaked out by it or whatever, which is, I never was, but some people are. Do you ever get that feeling when you're playing that maybe people are avoiding you in any way? Or some people, I mean, there are those people.
I absolutely experience this in my day-to-day life for sure, where, and it's kind of a lack of imagination and a lack of experience. And so for many people, I just know it's true. One of their biggest fears is not being able to see, and that's just true. So if you've never met a blind person before and you've never spent much time thinking about it, and you're not someone who's sort of maybe naturally empathetic, it's a really daunting idea. It's absolutely sort of mind-stopping, and you can't really think through, how does she even get out of bed in the morning? And so we like to think that we've come a long way, and we have, but I know from my day-to-day life that for many people it's a mind-stopping experience. So questions like, how do you get dressed in the morning? Something that is just like, if you really just work through it in your mind, you can figure it out. But that level of bafflement and confusion and genuine apprehension it's real. It's absolutely real.
Yeah. That must be difficult sometimes to just. I remember going out to dinners or whatever, and sometimes the server would say to me, "What does he want?"
Oh yeah, very common
like,
experience.
well, why don't you ask him yourself?
Right. Well, there's this. We're in a sighted world. You're based on eye contact, which is what we were talking about with the context of busking. So when someone's walking by me busking and they want to let me know that they like it, they're going to try to make eye contact with me and smile. And when that doesn't work, they're probably completely flummoxed. They don't understand why it's not working. And then maybe they see my cane and figure it out, but then there's this moment of, what do I do now? And the obvious thing is use your words, right?
Yeah.
But if you're just completely stymied and completely flummoxed in the moment, there's this, I don't know how to communicate with this person. And it's something that as blind people we experience on a regular basis. I would even say on a daily basis. Like you moving through the world, there's most people are pretty chill, pretty reasonable, but there's a hefty proportion of people who clearly have not met a blind person before, have not thought about it, have zero idea how they would exist, and so can't imagine how I exist and get through my day. So as much as we like to think so much has changed, the human mind hasn't changed all that much. And so when confronted with something new and frightening, if you don't have a naturally flexible mind, there's a good chance that you're just going to be sort of paralyzed and not know how to deal. And so you're going to say, what would she like for lunch? As though I can't hear or speak either. And it just takes a little imagination, a little empathy. But for some people in the immediate moment, that's too much for them to take in all at once.
There's another question I have, and that would be, he became blind at 18 from smallpox. So he had 18 years of seeing and being in the sighted world. And I know, like, when I first met Richard, I didn't really think about what does blind mean. Like, in my sighted mind, blind you couldn't see, sighted you could see, but I understand there's gradations of blindness, but also there are people who came to it later in life. I don't mean really later in life, but as an 18-year-old would have a different experience, I would think, than somebody who became blind at 3 or is blind from birth.
Absolutely. absolutely. And I think about this a lot with O'Carolan, because 17 or 18, that's the prime of life for a young man, and very patriarchal society, so all of a sudden he becomes sort of invalid, invalid in his world. So I think a lot about the resilience that it would take for him to overcome that and decide, I'm just going to keep doing, the things that I want to do, and I'm going to pursue the things I want to pursue, and that requires a lot of resilience. And there's a certain sense in which he may have understood the biases of his world better than I understand mine, because I was born blind. So I never experienced the walking down a street and seeing how many heads turn to watch me go with looks of like terror or just simple curiosity.
Not terror.
Yeah, well, maybe. But for him, someone who goes blind later in life, they know perfectly well what the social norms are and what things look like for around someone with a disability. So I think there is a significant difference.
Yeah. I was thinking about that when I read that he was 18. I'm like, or 17, 18. I'm like, that's interesting. Like, I wonder if he would have been as successful if he had been born blind or blinded at 1 or 2 or whatever.
It's a great question.
Who knows? We'll never know.
It's a great question also because he would know much better how to hold himself and how to comport himself visually to a sighted world than someone who was born blind. So that would be a big help in assimilating into the sighted world, is knowing how to look normal, making the air quotes, but how, the visual presentation, he would already know what that was all about and how important it was.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. I don't know if I have any other questions about your busking or anything like that, but as a sighted person who's been an ally of the blind community for a long time, I honestly forget sometimes that you're blind or whatever, And I said, one time I asked Richard to do something, and I was like, oh geez, you can't do that. And he goes, well, that's a great compliment.
It's true, it's true. It just becomes a characteristic, like the color of your hair or where you grew up or something. Once it becomes demystified, it just becomes a characteristic that someone has. And it doesn't just mean there's things I can't do. It means there's things that maybe I can do better than you can.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I've just have a different skill set. And so it's just about changing your sort of expectations and getting used to things.
I know that when I listen to music, I went to a TSO concert last month. Yeah, we're still in February. Last month with my daughter and son-in-law. And for me, if it's a piece I really like, there was 2 pieces there there were 3 main pieces they did. One was Mozart and one was Dvorak. And for me, I had to close my eyes, and that's just me, for those pieces that when I was really getting into it, because opening my eyes just took away from it. I just wanted to just hear and let the sound waves go through me, and I almost, or I do, see shapes in the music that I hear.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
So I think that, I'm not saying that being blind helps you be a better musician, I have no idea. But I think that sometimes when you take away one of your senses, like when I close my eyes, I feel the music more, if that makes sense.
There's a common thing people ask a lot, or assume, actually most people assume it. They say, oh, you must have excellent hearing, your hearing must be so much better, or your sense of touch must be so much better. And I'm uncertain, I'm ambivalent about that, because what I always say is I pay far more attention to what I hear and what I feel. Like my attention is much more closely tuned to those senses. So I don't think, if you did a hearing test, I don't think my hearing's any better. Touch, maybe, because I've learned to read Braille, but innately it doesn't mean that my other senses are enhanced.
Right.
And it may mean that my brain is giving more space to those sensory receptors, but it doesn't mean that my hearing is quantitatively better or that my touch is quantitatively better. I'm just processing them differently and maybe more thoroughly.
And maybe that's why by closing my eyes, I'm doing the same kind of thing to that music. That's really interesting. Now, we have a project going. We're not going to give the details right now, but you and I are working on a project about a couple of blind musicians from the classical era. And I think that when we start talking about it, I think we've got some more ideas or things that we might want to look into as we research them, just through this conversation. I mean, always it's always nice to have a back and forth conversation, have a guest in my podcast. Sometimes it's just going to be me talking about some hidden gem, and I know you're going to be on quite a few times, especially when we start talking about our project that we're working on. So I'm really excited about that, actually.
Me too. And as a storyteller, my mind just, I love, historical fiction is my genre of choice when it comes to writing and reading. So I love to think about musicians in history, and more recently, particularly about blind musicians, and just imagining their lives. Take the little skeleton facts that we have and try to build around them. Try to imagine how they reacted to their world, and what they thought, how they thought about themselves, how they felt about the world that they were in. And so I love to think about these ideas as super fertile.
Yeah, because we can't go back and ask them. I mean,
Right.
They might have written a few things down, but we can't go back and ask them, which I mean, unless there's time travel.
Maybe.
You never know.
You never know.
But yeah. Well, let's finish with one more song of O'Carolan. I do know his name. And this one I found is the Chieftains. They're one of the main groups that brought him back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So let's listen to this. This is just an O'Carolan medley. So here we go. I think that's just fun.
It is fun, and I know that song, but I didn't know it was O'Carolan.
Yeah.
I've heard that so many times when I'm just listening to random Irish, jiggy music, and I had no idea. See, I didn't know that. I didn't know that was O'Carolan, but I love that the Chieftains just took him up and said, let's expose his music to the world.
Yeah, they did. And I was reading that he apparently did not write like sorrowful music very well.
Oh.
So maybe he was just a really happy guy.
He's a happy guy, cheerful guy. I love that.
Guy, yeah.
How can we know someone's personality? I think that's such an interesting question. Can we understand someone's personality through their music? To what extent is that possible?
I think you definitely can, to a certain extent. Like Beethoven had a very difficult life and was very angry, and his music can show that. But he also had a very, very loving, tender side, because some of his slow movements show that. There's no way he couldn't have had a soft heart without being able to write those pieces. He had to have a soft heart.
There's a podcast episode right there, right? Different aspects of someone's musical life and how they convey emotion. Because I think sometimes we catch that and sometimes we don't. Like, what emotion does this music convey? And we can feel differently about it. But what can we learn about someone's personality through their compositions?
That's an interesting one. Maybe I'll put that on my list.
Endless.
Yeah, it is endless. I know, absolutely. Well, Chris, I want to thank you for coming today.
Oh, thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Great conversation.
And you're the one who opened me to O'Carolan's music. I didn't even really know about him until you mentioned him, so thank you for that. And you'll be back when we start talking about our project.
Lovely, lovely.
A little temptation there will be coming eventually. And we'll have a great day on this beautiful, sunny, wintry, snowy day, though.
Beautiful, thank you.
All right. Thank you for listening. Until next time.